Moro ndinovimba wapora tinokuga muchirai kujidzidzo ichi. Now, that, I imagine, lost you a little bit. But the reason that I decided that I would speak Shona is that I received a question which I think is worth everybody listening to, and well, hopefully my answer isn't too dreadful, from a student who said, well, I have just recently transitioned from a school in Zimbabwe in which I was taught in my home language of Shona, and I'm now at a school outside of the country in which I'm learning in English. So the question is, as someone learning in a second language, do you have some advice to help me learn the information quicker and follow the teachers quicker? And so I thought that I would begin this deliberately by speaking a little bit of Shona and making the obvious point that 99% of people watching this video had an immediate response when I began speaking. It was only 8 seconds worth, but I'm willing to bet that you weren't really focused at all at what was going on, which brings up a fairly interesting point, and that is, in at least one sense of the word, we're all learning in a second language when we do a subject, because almost all subjects naturally employ jargon and terms which mean that they are their own languages. Geography, in a sense, is its own language. History has got terms and facts which essentially constitute a new language. Mathematics is a form of language. So in at least one way, we're all learning in a second language. Now, of course, I don't mean to diminish what this student was saying, because she's absolutely right that it's that much more challenging for her having transitioned from Shona to English. But let's examine why this is so important. The idea of learning in a language with which one isn't entirely familiar automatically compromises one's ability to understand and to comprehend and to picture what's being said and to follow what's being said and consequently to remember what's being said. And I am going to quickly apply it simply to someone who's learning in English as a second language, as it were. So even a student who speaks English completely fluently, one of such students said to me a couple of years ago, "Sir, I've read this book and I just don't understand what it's saying." And I'm like, okay, well, fine. What's the first sentence? Okay, sir, it says, "In a country such as South Africa, with its numerous socio-economic problems, it is important that we need to be good citizens one unto another." I said, okay, that's lovely, darling. What are socio-economic problems? "I don't know, sir. What does it mean to be a good citizen one unto another?" She had no idea. Now, the idea is that when she said that, I thought, you're laboring under a misapprehension that you're supposed to know what's being said just because socioeconomic sounds English. Just because being a good citizen one unto another has got a sort of Anglo kind of sound to it does not mean that you were born understanding what those terms mean. So, of course, that child was losing concentration and focus and the ability to understand because she did not have the necessary vocabulary required to understand what's going on. And of course, that's exactly what happens when this other student who asked me this very clever question is suddenly hearing English, and by the way, she speaks English very well. So it's interesting. It's not that she's coming into it with a very low level of English. She's just saying there are quite a lot of words that are used which I don't know the meaning of. Now, for her, that might be a bit more extreme, but the exact same thing happens with you. I'm quite sure, if you're a student, that the teacher is bound to use certain words or terms that you don't know. If you don't know what socioeconomic inequality is, if you do not know what it means to be a good citizen one unto another, and then when they suddenly say these things are expressed by the Gini coefficient, well, if you don't know what a Gini coefficient is, of course, you lose the ability to understand what's going on. So I'm going to give a very simple bit of advice. I think that all students should find a dedicated highlighter as you can clearly see, I'm going to sleep. So I just grabbed this pen because this was here and I wasn't going to dash upstairs to find the highlighters, which are there. So let's just pretend that I wanted it to be this grey Koki, but you find a dedicated highlighter or a Koki, and any time you see a word or a phrase that you don't know the meaning of, you've got to highlight it. Or a dedicated coloured pen, so that if the teacher uses words or terms in the class which are clearly fundamental to understanding what's being said and you don't know their meaning, keep a separate book in which you write all of those words down. And then all that you need to do is learn what they mean. Now, I'm not going to cover that in this particular video. I've actually now taught that student how to increase vocabulary. It's one of my absolute favorite things to teach as a memory trick, is how to increase your vocabulary. But what you do have to do is flag what are the gaps in my ability to interpret what's being said. And usually those boil down to language. Even if it's the language of mathematics, knowing that M stands for gradient, for instance, well, that's exactly the same as knowing that pusillanimous means half-hearted. It's exactly the same thing. It's two bits of data that the brain needs to associate together and yet may forget. So the advice is you're learning in a second language, whether you know it or not. You might be learning in your home language, but the subjects which you're learning constitute a second language of their own. And whenever you find a word or a phrase or a term that you don't know the meaning of, highlight it or write it down in a dedicated color. And then to make your life particularly easy, I would say, especially for the student who asked me this question, Maite Basa for the question, it really was a very good one, I would then say, write down in your own language, which by the way might just be simpler English, or in her case, Shona, write down what the word means, so that then when you go through the book and you think, just hang on, what on earth, socioeconomic, the gap between rich and poor, or whatever the case might be, you can then follow what's being said. There you go, 7 minutes of advice as to how to learn in a second language.